If you've ever wondered why movie popcorn costs more than your ticket, or why seatbelts might actually cause more accidents, or how a baby on board sign might be doing more than just tugging at your heartstrings, or if you've ever looked at everyday life and thought, there has to be an explanation for this, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'm reviewing The Armchair Economist, Economics and Everyday Life by Stephen Landsburg. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're diving into a revised and updated for the 21st century edition of The Armchair Economist, a book that's been kicking around since the 90s, I believe the early 90s, but it still sparks conversation and some controversy. Landsburg is known for taking basic economic principles and applying them to everything from insurance premiums to celebrity endorsements to why U2 tickets always sell out. Just a little bit on the author, Stephen E. Landsburg. He is an American economist, author, and professor at the University of Rochester. He is known for his provocative and often controversial takes on economic, legal, and political issues. Landsburg writes from a staunchly libertarian perspective, emphasizing individual choice and free market principles. He earned his PhD in mathematics from the University of Chicago in 1979 and began his teaching career at Colorado State University before joining the University of Rochester. In addition to his academic work, Landsburg is widely known for his popular writing, including his long-running Slate column on everyday economics and books like this one, The Armchair Economist, which apply economic reasoning to real-world situations. He has written for major outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and has not shied away from controversy, often drawing criticism for his unapologetically rationalist approach to sensitive topics. His academic interests span microeconomics, philosophy of science, and mathematics, and he has received teaching awards for his work in economic education. Now, taking a look at this actual book, The Armchair Economist, Economics and Everyday Life, the author uses a lively and provocative exploration of economic theory applied to the real world through a series of essays that are both accessible and often, as I've said several times now, controversial. Landsburg invites readers to think like economists, to take a rational choice theory, the power of incentives and market efficiency seriously, not just in the classroom or marketplace, but in everyday life. Originally, it was published in 1993, and there's at least this revised edition, which came out in 2012. I don't know if there's been more editions than that. The book blends economic logic with current events, as well as many of his personal anecdotes and public debates to highlight how seemingly mundane actions are underpinned by deep economic principles. So let me give you an actual breakdown. There are several sections. Part 1, he titled What Life is All About. It covers chapters 1 through 5. This section lays the philosophical and practical foundation of the book. He argues that people respond to incentives and rational behavior underpins most human decisions. So in chapters like How Seatbelts Kill, he argues that safer cars can paradoxically lead to more accidents because drivers adjust their behavior when perceived risk changes. Using this incentive-based logic, he challenges commonly held views on safety, environmentalism, and even birth control, suggesting that well-meaning policies can often backfire. Similarly, in Rationale Riddles, he unpacks oddities like sold-out U2 concerts and pricing anomalies, arguing that firms often forego higher ticket prices to attract more engaged fans who spend more on merchandise. These rational explanations, he insists, often outperform more emotionally satisfying ones. Truth or Consequences dives deeper into information asymmetry, showing how even group restaurant bills and executive salaries can be explained through economic modeling. In Part 2, Good and Evil, which covers chapters 6 through 9, Landsburg explores normative questions of economics, including what constitutes right and wrong from an efficiency perspective, not necessarily from a moral perspective. So in chapters like The Pitfalls of Democracy, he critiques majority rule, arguing that it may not always lead to optimal outcomes. In one chapter, Why Taxes Are Bad, he breaks down the concept of dead weight loss and introduces readers to how taxes can distort behavior. By contrast, in one chapter, Why Prices Are Good, he juxtaposes Darwinian and Smithian views on market competition, extolling the virtues of prices as information carriers that promote efficiency. In his chapter, Economics in the Courtroom, he looks at legal case studies and how they're used to illustrate how legal decisions have economic consequences. In Part 3, How to Read the News, chapters 10 through 15, Dr. Landsburg turns a sharp eye to media narratives and political discourse. In The Mythology of Deficits, he argues that government deficits are often misunderstood and that focusing solely on deficit size without context can lead to poor policy. In another chapter, How Statistics Lie, he makes the case that media reporting of economic data is often misleading, whether in discussions of unemployment or GDP. In another chapter, Do We Need More Illiterates?, he points to how perverse incentives can lead to counterintuitive outcomes, such as disincentivizing education when subsidies are poorly designed. In part 4, How Markets Work, chapters 16 through 21, this is probably the most traditional economic section of the whole book. By diving into market mechanisms and pricing and game theory, he definitely details some much more traditional elements of economics. So in chapters like Why Popcorn Costs More at the Movies, he uses the example of course, movie theater concessions to explore price discrimination. In his chapter Courtship and Collusion, he analyzes human relationships like mating as a market with collusive and competitive elements. In Cursed Winners and Glum Losers, he introduces auction theory and winner's curse scenarios. He also covers financial markets, randomness in stock prices, and predictive behavior in his chapters Random Walks in Stock Market Prices and Armchair Forecasting. In his chapter The Iowa Car Crop, he uses a clever parable to explain the economic logic of free trade, showing how importing cars from Japan is functionally equivalent to giving them in Iowa via export revenue. Part 5, The Pitfalls of Science, covers chapters 22 and 23, which are entitled Was Einstein Credible? And New Improved Football. Landsburg uses these two chapters to critique how scientific authority and economic modeling sometimes rely too much on consensus or aesthetics rather than logic or testable hypotheses. These chapters emphasize the dangers of relying on flawed metrics or poorly designed incentives in research or policy. I actually, as I recall, because I have encountered his stuff in just other fields and other things, I believe this was two of the most cited chapters, especially the one on football. He has this interesting experimentation with trying to force teams to go for it more often on 4th down as opposed to going 3 and out and then punting the ball. And so the conclusion is to, instead of having 4 downs, only have 3 downs, assuming that that would force teams to go for it more often. And they don't. Instead, they just find themselves punting more often on the 3rd down. And so that was an interesting thought experiment that I actually think I've encountered more often in other places. I think that's probably two of the more popular chapters that are not necessarily as controversial, because it really is most controversial probably comes from part 6, The Pitfalls of Religion. This covers chapter 24. It is just that one chapter, and it is entitled Why I'm Not an Environmentalist. And as I've said, it is probably the book's most controversial. In it, Landsburg critiques environmentalist orthodoxy, arguing that many environmental initiatives are based on moralizing rather than cost-benefit analysis. And he calls for viewing ecological decisions through the same economic lens used for other public policy, emphasizing trade-offs, efficiency, and revealed preferences. This chapter drew significant backlash for its dismissive tone towards environmental concerns, but it also remains a stark illustration of Landsburg's libertarian perspective. This book has a wide variety of topics, but there are a few thematic and really important through lines I think worth noting. So, for example, he puts a lot of emphasis on economics as universal logic, and he argues that economic reasoning applies everywhere, from traffic safety to environmental activism to dating. Also, he puts a lot of emphasis on incentives and unintended consequences. That is a consistent theme that he thinks well-intentioned policies often go awry when they ignore how incentives shape behavior and, of course, the subsequent unintended consequences. Also, he argues for skepticism of government and regulation. He is deeply suspicious of policies that interfere with markets, and he frequently targets bureaucracy, political correctness, and government inefficiency. You can guess this is obviously probably where he gets the most blowback, especially from his fellow academics, although economics tends to be a somewhat distinct field in which there well, I'd have to say my experience is that a lot of academic economics still tend to be much more liberal. However, I would say there's certainly a robust diversity of thought within economics that tends to get pretty well represented in the larger economic sphere. And this is just one of the things that I think gets him some of the most attention. He also argues frequently for rational choice theory. He insists that assuming rationality, even if not always accurate, produces more useful and testable models than assuming people behave irrationally. And of course, he uses all sorts of controversial analogies. He is known for applying economic logic to sensitive topics, often drawing fire for reductive or provocative comparisons. His essays on the death penalty, as well as rape hypotheticals and healthcare, reflect this tendency. Let me start by saying that I have no idea why I picked this book up at this particular time. The original book is quite old. The revised version of it now at this point is more than a decade old. I think it was just on like a to-read list for a long time, and somehow it just rose to the top, maybe because it was available on Spotify or something. I don't remember why I chose this. And I will say, as someone that generally really enjoys and respects discussions about economics, there is a lot to admire in The Armchair Economist. I appreciated the book's broad application of economic principles to the quirks of everyday life, like seatbelt laws and concert ticket pricing and the decision to tip at restaurants. The author has a talent for taking economic concepts and making them accessible and even entertaining, and at his best, he offers examples that genuinely make you rethink how incentives and markets operate in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. That said, I often found myself raising an eyebrow, sometimes skeptically, sometimes in outright disagreement. Too many of his conclusions were clearly ideological provocations more than grounded economic reasoning. For a book that insists it's all about logic, Landsburg seems remarkably comfortable making sweeping assertions that rest on very narrow or dubious assumptions. He positions himself as merely a dispassionate economist, but it's clear that his politics drive much of his analysis rather than being shaped by it. And it becomes harder to take the economic arguments at face value when they so conveniently line up with a specific worldview over and over again, something which he himself is highly critical of others doing, and yet it becomes more and more obvious that he is doing the same thing. There's also a sense that he's more interested in being clever than in being convincing. Well, the thought experiments are often engaging. They're just parlor tricks. They're not serious explorations. It's economics as gotcha logic, and it can be fun for a while, but it also can be occasionally grating. And well, some of his counterintuitive claims are genuinely illuminating. Others are just counterintuitive for the sake of being contrarian. And I think after a while, it really started to wear thin. And he did have quite a few examples that I'm confident I have heard very strong rebuttals to. I started actually listing them out. His one about the seatbelts is probably the most common one. A lot of things that he has to say about environmentalism, which I already said is the most probably controversial. A lot of the things he says, I have seen some great rebuttals of. And so I really started to wonder, it got harder and harder to really take him at face value that he is being dispassionate when that simply tended to be these thought experiments or these analogies that were only reinforcing something he already had decided, and it wasn't necessarily very strong evidence, and in many cases there has been very strong evidence to prove otherwise, and that would probably be my strongest issue with this book. So who is this book for? I would say it is for readers who already have a decent grasp of basic economic principles and want to see those ideas applied, sometimes creatively, sometimes provocatively, to everyday life. So if you enjoy the thought experiments or the counterintuitive arguments and, of course, the intellectual exercise of using economic logic to challenge conventional wisdom, then I think The Armchair Economist will likely appeal to you. It's especially good for people who like books in the tradition of Freakonomics or The Naked Economist, though it leans more ideologically libertarian than those books. I would say professors looking to supplement an intro to economics course with real-world examples might find some useful chapters to spark class discussion or debate. And it's also for people who aren't afraid to engage with arguments that they may not agree with. If you're the kind of reader who likes to wrestle with big claims and test them against your own logic or moral framework, this book gives you plenty to chew on. So who is this not for? Well, this is not a good introduction to economics, in my opinion. For someone brand new to the field, I would recommend finding something that's a little softer and a little more structured. Despite the title, it's not really a gentle or balanced entry point. The tone can certainly be smug, which can put off someone that's just trying to get to know the field, and the assumptions, as I've already said, can be a bit narrow, which again, I found counterproductive for the claim that he was making. And of course, I found that many of the arguments are driven more by his ideology than actual data or nuance, or by his thought experiments, which, by the way, are not data, they're just thought experiments. And so if you're looking for a clear, fair-minded explanation of foundational economic principles or something that distinguishes carefully between empirical insight and political opinion, you're probably better off starting somewhere else. That being said, I probably still wouldn't recommend the other economics books that I've already referenced, like Freakonomics or The Naked Economist. I think those are great reads as well. But I actually don't have a great introduction to economics if you're looking for a much more neutral, but also a much more structured approach to economics. It is also probably not for readers who are turned off by provocative hypotheticals or by what can come across as dismissive attitudes towards stuff like regulations, environmentalism, or public policy concerns. And so if you're seeking a book that incorporates ethics or social justice into its economic reasoning, this certainly is not it, but there are plenty out there that you can certainly find that in. Landsburg is not trying to persuade across political divides. He's trying to provoke, and that's not to everyone's taste. So this book is not going to be for everyone. Of course, I would love to know what your thoughts on the Armchair Economist are, or any of other Landsburg's works if you've read them, or other economics books that are written by experts but are designed for a broad audience. I would certainly love to hear more thoughts and recommendations. Please let me know what you're thinking in the comments. If you're enjoying this video or any of my videos, please share it with a friend or a couple of friends or all your friends. Please help me spread the word about some good books and some controversial books. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.